Hello, people of the internet, and of course, my cis140 professor. As we talked about in part 1, I went over a bunch of different challenges that I have for my cis140 midterm, and of course, we're going to continue on. And we're going to pick up off on challenge 16. So basically, with this one, what we had to do is we were given a couple words and we had to remove the vowels from them. So what it's doing is it's basically calling this function, and we're passing this time code Smith. The next time it's passing banana, and the third time it is passing hello world. So when we do call this function str for our string here, what it'll do is it'll take, let's say for example, it'll take this code Smith here and pass it into pass it into the str, and then we can call the replace function to the str. And inside of this, what we did is we tell it all the vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, and we want to replace them with nothing. So basically, in a sense, it'll remove the vowels because you're replacing it with nothing. And then it'll obviously return it. So when we run code Smith, it comes back with CD MSTH. Banana comes back with BNN, and hello world comes back with HLLWRLD. All right. Moving on to 17. With this, we were given an array and a number. We were given an object with a word in it as the key and a number with as the value. And what we had to do with this is take the word and put that in an array so many times, and that depends on the value. So right here we have a 2, so we need to put in cats into it twice. We have it right for dogs, we have it for 1, so we need to put dogs in 1 time. And what we would do is it calls the function and passes that object. So in input, puts the object in there, and then we go through. So we create a temporary array called ROutput, and obviously it's empty. And once again, like I said in the previous video, we'll be seeing a lot of for loops. And this time we're using a particular one called a for in loop. So what this will do is this will take we'll create a kind of a temporary holder called items. And this will take each item in our object and kind of increment it through, right? And we then specify what object we want. We want the input object, the one that we pass through, right? And then it will step through. Now what we do is we have a nested for loop, but this is a regular for loop. So we have a for loop in a regular for loop inside our for in loop. And obviously, we declare I as 0. But what we do is we take the value of input at that particular item. So what this is basically saying is, what item are we at? And when we first pass it through, we're at cats. The value of it is 2. So basically, this function here collapses down to 2. Right? And it will go through it twice. Right? The second time, it'll go on to the next item, and it'll take dogs. And it will put, say, okay, what is the value of dogs? And it will be 1. So it'll go through, this will collapse down to 1, and then right? And it will execute. So, simply put, let's take our first example, cats. Takes it in, this goes to 2. So what this will do is it'll take the current item, which again is cats, because that's the first item, and it will basically put it into our array. So there's our output, we push it, and we push item, which is cats, in once, we loop back, 0 gets, so I starts off as 0, it gets incremented, again, here, gets incremented, because there's the increment to 1, I is now, I is now equal to 1, so this basically becomes 1, this is 2, this is still true, we increment it through again, right, so item, we then push it once again. So that's why, if you look at our output here, you have cats twice, because we pushed that particular item twice. Right, I gets incremented again, so I is now 2. So this is 2, and this is 2. So this statement here, 2 is not less than 2, or in this case, I is not less than input of the item. So it drops out, and it goes back up to this for loop, or this for in loop. Right, we then take the second value, which is dogs. Pop that into items, because it's part of this input. So then it goes in, right back to this for loop, I gets reset to 0, and then we take it, so this is now 1. So 0 is less than 1, or I is less than input of items. Run through, we'll take dogs this time, because that's the new item, and push it in. Right, so then I gets incremented, I is now 1, 1 is not less than 1, so this is false. It exit, right, it then exits this for loop, comes back up to this, there's no more items, it exits out this for loop, and then it takes our array, which we just pushed all this stuff into, and returns it, right, as output. So basically, when we do a console log here, this whole thing collapses to whatever is in here, which basically, if we look at our output, is that right there. Now, if we go to our second output, there's nothing to be passed in there. So, guess what it's going to pass out? Right? It's going to pass out an empty array, because we weren't able to put anything in that array, because there's nothing to be put in there. So, it'll basically bring this down into input. It'll create this temporary array. There's no items. This for loops gets skipped, which in respect basically means if we never go into this for loop, we never go into that for loop. And it basically just returns an empty array. So, there you go. Moving on. Now, for this next one, challenge 18, we were given an array with some words here. And you can see it's called animals. And what we had to basically do is we had to pluralize it. So dog has to become dogs, cat has to become cats, tree frog needs to become tree frogs. So, and then we obviously have to console this out here. So, basically, in this console log, we call this function, and we pass it the array of animals, right? We then create, right? We pass it through this variable called rInput. Once again, we use a standard for loop. And we set our counter, right? I's our counter, set to 0, right? And then we pull out the length. So whatever the length of this is, in this case it's 3, so then this becomes 3, standard incrementation. So what we do is in this for loop is we take each item, so we take dogs, right? So we take the value of it, which is dogs, we use this concatenate function, which is basically a fancy way of saying add something, and we're going to add the letter S. And then put it into our array here. Now also, if you notice, once again, we're using I not only to increment our for loop, but to increment each position in our array. So I starts off at 0, right? The position 0 in our array is dogs. When we re-increment it, it'll become 1, then this will become cats. Increment it again, this will become value 2, right? You know, tree frog is in position 2, then we'll pull that down. And again, you can see that I is the indicator right here. Right? So for each time we go through this for loop, we take the value, plug it in, add S, and put it back in the same spot. And once we've cycled through this the entirety of the for loop, and the entirety of the array, we basically take what we've changed and return it back. So basically, when we do a console log, this whole function here, this whole call here, basically collapses to the value of this. And if you look down here, there it is. And everything that was added now has an S. So dog is now dogs, cat is now cats, tree frog is now tree frogs. And we will move on to another question. Let's go down the... So, moving on to challenge 23. So, what we had to do here is we have an array, 1, with a bunch of words in it, and we have a second array with similar words. But if you notice, it's the same words, but the casing is different. So here, high is lowercased. Here, high is uppercased. We also have a function that basically converts everything to capitals. So what we had to do here is we had to compare these two, capitalize the ones in the first array, and then compare them to the second array. So if they were equal, they would then go into an object where the first array was the key and the second array was the value. So for example, we have high lowercase and high uppercase. So if high lowercase, we'll write when we run it through to uppercase, so if this converted to uppercase equals this, pop this in the object where this is the key and this is the value. Right? Like if we look at the next one here, howdy converted to capitals is not equal to howdy with just the H capital, so we would ignore this. You know, bye and bye, well, this converted to capital would equal this, so yes. This converted to capital would not equal this. And, you know, the same for hello. So, taking a look here. So here's our function. Basically simple. You pop in a string, right? Takes the string and it returns it converted to uppercase. And here's our console log. And it's going to call this object ob of matches, and it will pass the first array, so R1, second array, R2, and the function, which is uppercase. So when we do call it, it'll pass it to array 1, so R1 will get put into the variable array1, R2 will get put into array2, and uppercase will get put into func1. Right here, we're going to create a empty object, and what we will do is, once again, we're using a standard for loop. You will see these everywhere in code. These are, especially with arrays, they are ridiculously common. So once again, we're not only going to use I as a way to increment through the count for the for loop, but we're going to use it as a way to increment through each, not only the first array, but the second array. So here's what we're going to do. Start off I equals 0. You have the array.length, which is going to find the length of the array, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5. We take it. This will collapse down to 5, and we will increment I. Right? So I starts off as 0, and then we'll do a simple if. And what we will do is we will then call the function that we passed here. So we have func1, which is then going to reference this function here to uppercase. So what it'll do is it'll take the first value of high, so this high, not the capital high, the high, this high, right, which was passed in through our array 1. It'll take that value, put it into func1, right, which is this function here. So we're passing this right through this function, through this, which is then going to pass it through this and into this function, right? So it'll capitalize high. So this basically, for the first run through this, the first go through for this for loop, this will collapse to a capital version of high. So then you have your second array here, which will take this second high and compare them if they're equal, which, guess what? They are, because a capitalized version of this is equal to equal to this high here. So we have temp object, we take array, take the lowercase version, because again we did not call the func1 here. Take that, and that will then become our key, because this is the way you can denote a key for our object here, which we ended up calling temp object. Then we'll take the second array, or the value at position 0, because again, I is equal to 0, so here you go, I, when this is at 0, is high, I, for array at 0, when it's 0, here's array 2, we'll take high. So we'll take the capital high, give it the value, pop it in, right, with high at the first value, and pop that into temp object. So once again, we'll increment through this for loop. I now becomes 1. I is still less than 5, because remember, this gets the length, and this is basically collapses down to 5. So we can go through it again. I is now equal to 1, so right, so then we'll pass howdy into our function, or I should say our funct1, capitalize it, so then this here collapses down to a capitalized version of howdy, which is not equal to this version of howdy, right? Because I, at position I, which is 1, at array 2 is not equal to, which is this. So this howdy, capitalized, is not equal to that howdy. So we'll skip over this. Obviously, we'll go to 3, pass in by right at the second position, because again, we've gone through this for loop again. I got incremented to 2, take by, pass it into the function, capitalize it again. This collapses down to a capitalized version of by. We take, we put in a 2 for I, because I is now currently 2, and we look at array 2, which is position, right? So in array 2 in R2 at position 2 is by. The capitalized version of this is equal to that. And again, we pop that in, and we'll just go through later, and we'll go through hello, right? Once we've Done that, I will eventually be incremented to 5. There's nothing in position 5, but I, which after incrementing through later and hello, will be 5. The array length is 5. So then 5 is not less than 5. It'll fail the for loop, exit out, and it will return the temp object, which had loaded high, because a capitalized version of this is equal to that, by, because a capitalized version of this is equal to that, and hello, because a capitalized version of this is equal to that, and return that. And if you look at our output, there it is. Right? So moving on to 24. So basically, what this is we were given an array of strings. So right here you have beer and glue. And what we had to do for this is put this into an object where the key is the word and the value is a capitalized version of it. So, there you go for beer, and there's glue. And this time, we also have a capitalized function. So what we need to do is we need to pass this and our capitalized function into our add objects array. So when the add to ob or add to objects is called, we will pass this array and this function. So when we call it, here we go. We're going to have our array, which is, we're passing it r of strings, and then we're also going to have a callback, which is going to be the function of capitalize. We're also going to create a temporary object, which again we're going to call. We're going to take, right, because we have to plug our values into an object, and we're going to create a temporary name holder right there. And once again, we're working with an array, so guess what there's going to be? There's going to be a for loop, but once again, we're using a for in loop. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take the value in the array that was passed. So this time, first iteration through, it's going to be beer. And we're basically going to take it. So we have our array, which is going to be, which we passed r of strings, and the item is going to be beer. And we're going to put that in name. So what we'll do here is we'll set it up and we'll add this to the object. So there's our temp ob. We'll create the key, which is called name. And then what we'll do is we'll use our callback function and we'll pass it the particular value that we're currently on, which is going to be beer, from our array, and we'll pass that through the callback to our capitalize function. So right here. So we'll take this, pass it through, it'll capitalize it and return it. So basically this will collapse to a capitalized version of beer, and we'll take this value and plug it in with the key name of that. So basically it will yield you beer lowercase as the key, beer capital as the value. So once we do that, we go to our next object, because once again we're in a for in loop. The next item is glue, and once again we'll do this. We'll take it, pass it into, take the item out of glue. So we'll take that particular item out of the array, which is glue, pop it into name, take name, set that as the key, and then we'll take our callback. Once again, take glue, which would be that particular item out of the array, pass in the callback, capitalize it, and then you'll have lowercase glue, and this will collapse to a capitalized version of glue, and there you go. Lowercase glue, capital glue. Right. So, moving on to challenge 31, which is going to be the last challenge we're going to talk about in this video, or these videos. So what we have here is we were given an array called 3-day weekend. We have Friday, Sat, and Sunday. We also were given a variable called getDay, and in that was a function called cycleIndicator, and it would be inputted in an array, and we would feed a temporary variable called 3-day weekend. So then, with that, right below it, and then we have the function here below it. So this ties into this. So when we do a console log and we get getDay, and we pass it the first array of 3-day weekend, it'll take this, right, call this variable, which is this function here, we'll pass it 3-day weekend in here, and it'll start to execute. The other thing to note is up here we created a global variable called count set to 0. We'll explain why this is important in a minute. But if going through, we go down to the if statement here, and we take count, which is equal to 0, and we check. Each time we run through this, we will increment count by 1 for each time that we use it. So if count is greater than or equal to the length of the array, we know that we hit the end because there's value 0, value 1, and value 2. So if it ends up going to, let's say, value 3, we know there's no value 3. Or there's no position 3, I should say. So what will end up happening is it will reset the counter. So all this is just a way to reset the counter. And you can see it'll set count equal to 0. So what it'll do is each time it's called, it'll run through this, check to see if the counter needs to be reset. Let's just say it starts off at Friday, position 0. So no, it does not, because it's not, so because 0 is not greater than the length of the array, or 3. So it skips over this, and we increment it by 1. So the count is now 1. Now, if you notice, it's going to take the temporary version of 3-day weekend. It's going to take the value of count, which is 1, and minus it, because we need to increment it before we exit out of this function, but we still need a way to get the first value, because if we increment it and then add 1 and just we incremented it and then got just the value by itself, we would start off at Saturday. So what we need to do is we need to get Friday. So then you'll take 1 minus 1, which will give you 0, and you'll get position 0, or Friday, and it will return the value of Friday. So this, the first time it's called, will collapse down to Friday, or fry, I should say. The next time that we call it, remember, count, because we incremented it here, is now equal to 1. So when we call this again, this will stay, count will stay as 1, because it is a global variable. Right? So it gets called again, we call this function, right, and we pass it 3-day weekend, or it gets passed again, right, count is equal to 1, which is not greater than or equal to the length of the array, which again, the length of the array is 3, so 1 is not greater than or equal to 3, So we skip over the reset, which is this here, and we increment it once again. So then count gets incremented from 1 to 2. Once again, we take count, minus it by 1, so 2 minus 1 is 1. We get position 1, it returns Saturday. Second time around. Right, we do this again. We run through, pass everything through. It checks, count got incremented, now it is 2. With 2 is not greater than or equal to 3, because this is 3. Skip over this, increment it to 3, and then again, we get 3 minus 1 is 2. Sunday, return Sunday. Now here's where it gets interesting. Once again, we have the get day. We call it. We pass everything through. Count is now equal to 3. 3 is greater than or equal to the length of the array, which is 3. 3 equals 3. So then we're going to execute this count here. That will then reset it to 0. Right? We take count, we increment it, count plus plus, which is going to give us 1, or increment it by 1, because 0 plus 1 is 1. And then, once again, we will return the value of count minus 1. So count got incremented to 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. There you position. And then if we go back to this array, position 0 is fry. And that's how we can reset it to keep counting. So fry, if we look at our output, fry, sat, sun, and then we've reset it to give us Friday. So, once again, YouTube and people of the internet, and Professor, of course, thank you for watching. If you enjoy these kind of computery code videos, I have a couple other nerdy kind of computer videos up on my channel. I have a bunch of other technology videos. Recommend checking them out. And as always, once again, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.